The corridor smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee, sharp enough to sting the back of Jennifer Mitchell's throat, familiar enough that she could have walked it blindfolded. Fluorescent lights hummed in a tired rhythm. On her left, a vending machine blinked, out of order. On her right, a mahogany door held a vase of white lilies, perfect and terrible, their chromosomes of pollen invisible until someone was already on the floor. She had $47 until Friday. She had told herself that aloud enough times that it had become a small litany. $47, inhaler refilled, Tyler's birthday cake, rent. Tyler sleeping under a blanket he'd flung over himself like a cape. Tyler's soft, clever face. Tyler's wheeze in the middle of the night that always left Jennifer awake long after the coffee had gone cold. She'd been on her feet since 5. The cleaning cart behind her smelled of disinfectant and lemon oil, a thin, honest perfume for the work she did. She tightened the strap of her gloves and pushed the cart's squeaky wheel forward, counting the rooms she had left to vacuum in the executive wing. The thud came from down the hall, dull, close to a body hitting floor. It was the kind of sound that makes the world contract, that pulls oxygen out of a room. Jennifer froze, then moved with the kind of speed habit lends, 1 part fear, 2 parts procedure. She had learned to react before apologies had time to form in her mouth. The mahogany door was ajar. Inside, the lilies were upturned, their petals a white halo around a man in a suit, his body folded like a coat draped over a chair. Marcus Whitfield's shoes were polished to an obscene shine. He had a hand cupped at his throat, a leaf from a lily stuck to his cuff. His face had gone the same color as the lily's centers, a faint, collapsing yellow that made Jennifer think of hospital bed sheets, of cheap candles blown out. His breaths were shallow, fished and failing in his chest. She checked for airway, for responsiveness, because that's what you did. Words came without thinking. "Sir, can you hear me?" Then no answer. She felt the shape of panic on the other side of her ribs and shoved it under the steady hand of training and instinct. She moved toward him, fingers trembling but clear. In one of the suit pockets she found a small dark cylinder clipped to the lining, an EpiPen. It was a ridiculous object, cheap plastic, a bright cap, carried like a talisman against the sudden, terrible thing that lilies and shellfish and unknown allergens could do. Her hands were steadier than she felt. She pressed the injector into the man's thigh, through cloth, and heard the soft click. Protocol is blunt and small. Inject, compress, wait, monitor. The seconds slid like marbles. He coughed once, like a distant animal waking, and then the world thinned to a single, sharp, panicked breath. He went limp again. She leaned unnatural and too close to a man whose life she did not know, who at some distant point had probably sat behind a mahogany desk and made decisions that moved other people's lives like chess pieces. Her face brushed his. Something in her, older than policy, rose, the instinct to jolt, to touch, to do whatever might pull a person back. Her lips pressed a quick, absurd, automatic contact to the corner of his mouth. Not a movie kiss, not a romantic sweep, but a pragmatic, animal thing, like warming a frozen baby's hand. He coughed as if woken from a long sleep. His eyes trembled open. They were the green of shallow water. For a heartbeat, everything reasserted itself. Beeping machines in another life, the buzz of a city, the sourness of the vending machine, the lilies, bright and obscene. And then the world pulled back as the nurse down the hallway called his name, and the hospital staff flooded the corridor as if someone had opened a valve. There was noise, rubber soles, the metallic clink of instruments, voices clipped and efficient. Jennifer stepped back, a dozen shapes of mortification filling her. She had touched his face. She had kissed him. The word her brain supplied was small and immediate and hard-edged. Inappropriate. Her cheeks were hot under the fluorescent lights. She wiped her fingers on the hem of her sleeve as if that could erase the moment like a stain. He blinked at her with a combination of confusion and, curiously, gratitude. "Thank you," he managed, voice gravelly as if sand had been swallowed. His hand closed briefly around hers, not with ownership, but with something like relief. In the rush of professionals, in the focus of stabilizing a man who had just nearly died for pollen, the world brokered thanks in small tokens. Then Victoria Hartwell walked in like an entrance, heels that stabbed the floor, a silk dress sharp and severe, the sort of smile that functioned as a blade. Her eyes landed on Jennifer like a judge with the gavel halfway raised. The color left Jennifer's cheeks all the way to her collarbone. "Marcus," Victoria said. "Not a warm name, more a possession." "What in God's name?" Her voice slashed open a space to make a spectacle of the scene. The staff murmured and backed away. Marcus's face had clarity now, the haze of the reaction dissolving into something more lucid. He looked between them, and then at Jennifer. And in that look, something complicated happened. Embarrassment for the proximity, gratitude for the EpiPen, a flicker of something intrigued. For a man whose life unfolded in private jets and boardrooms, her hands on him were a breach and a revelation in one motion. Victoria's contempt made the corridor colder than the antiseptic. Who are you?" she demanded, gaze flicking to her hand that rested blankly on a business card she'd pulled from his jacket. His card, not his pocket. "Security! Take her!" Marcus's hand went out, not to stop, but to calm. He had the kind of voice that could say no without shouting. "Victoria, not here." His eyes were on Jennifer again. "She saved me." "Saved you?" Victoria echoed, as if the word could be bent into ridicule. Her jaw tightened. "Saved you? By kissing you?" Jennifer felt the heat of every head in the corridor. There was a thin auditory line between the factual and the salacious. Rumor takes the shorter route. Whispers began like small insects. Marcus straightened where he sat up, the clinical light cutting into his suit. He reached into the pocket his EpiPen had come from and found his phone. He turned to Jennifer slowly, the action deliberate. "May I ask your name?" "Jennifer," she said, measured. "Jennifer Mitchell. Cleaning supervisor. Mother." She felt absurd saying anything more. She had been practicing dignity for so long that it had become a muscle. She flexed it now. "I'm Marcus Whitfield," he said. "I'd like to give you this." He held out a card that looked like everything someone with too much powers card would look like. Thick, almost obscene in its economy, embossed with a name that bent light. His fingers brushed hers. "A meeting. I want to talk. There are things I'd like to discuss with you, if you'll let me." Victoria's face contracted. "A meeting?" she repeated, and the word was a spear. "Is this—" She didn't finish. In the maw of her expression was 1,000 unspoken consequences. How this would look at the country club, at the board dinner, at the charity gala where glass clinked and people pretended to know the struggles of the less fortunate. Jennifer felt something in her throat that was equal parts embarrassment and a strip of fuel, the splintering logic of hunger. To refuse could be a point of pride. To accept could be a sentence to a life rearranged. She thought of Tyler's inhaler, of the price on the pharmacy receipt that felt like a verdict. She pictured the stack of bills on the tiny kitchen table at home, the way the landlord had accidentally miscounted a late fee into her ledger. She folded the card into her gloved hand and let the information and the risk and the adrenaline settle. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was small but steady. I can't take someone's pity, sir. I have work. I have a job. I'll do what I do." She turned toward the cart because there were tiles to sweep, rooms that would wait for no scandal. It is easier sometimes to be invisible than to be a flaw someone else waits to remark upon. Marcus watched her move. His gaze was frank, almost as if the taste of the corridor had changed for him. "Not pity," he said, and the word was careful. An opportunity. If you ever change your mind. He left the card on the ledge of a nearby table like a small, dangerous artifact. Jennifer could have left it there, let rumor and routine swallow the thing. Instead, she slid it into the pocket of her jacket, feeling the weight of it as if the cardstock contained a future she did not have the right to assume but could no longer ignore. The hospital staff escorted Marcus inside. Victoria hovered like a shadow, the kind that follows even when you try to turn the light up. When the corridor finally eased back into its habitual hum, people straightened and whispered and went back to their own invisible labor. Jennifer wiped her palms again, as if after the action there could be no residue. Her cart's wheel groaned under her control. She resumed cleaning, the rhythm of her hands a tether to the ordinary. By the time she finished the last office and pushed open the heavy service door into the stairwell, the late afternoon city had the softened light of a day that would not wait for anyone's drama. The stairs smelled faintly of floor polish and the fryer from a street vendor below. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from the pharmacy reminding her of a pickup, then another from her sister asking if she could babysit on Saturday. Tyler was at home with Mrs. Lyle next door watching cartoons. Jennifer had promised to be back by 7 because of the hem of the world she held together with small promises. When she finally sat on the curb and pushed the cart's wheels into the alley, her knees complained. She counted again, $47. The thought was a private ritual, an inventory of survival. She dialed the bank app on the cracked screen and forced a smile at a toddler with balloon hands who pursued a pigeon across the plaza. Want to see whether she takes the offer or walks away? A voice from an earbud she'd meant to toss down in a drawer proposed the question like an advertisement. It felt absurd to think of herself as entertainment. Still, she pressed the screen to accept. Like and stay tuned, the recorded voice chirped, because even in the middle of everything, someone wanted clicks. She told the kid at the diner where she used to work that she'd have the birthday cake by next Friday, the voice of a woman rehearsing provision. The card in her pocket scraped against her thigh like a small pointed reminder. That night, she lay awake long after Tyler had dreamt and folded himself around a teddy bear, listing out ways to make $100 in a week. She thought about Marcus Whitfield's profile picture that had briefly flashed into her mind as he lay on the floor, an older man with a watch like a small planet, a life catalogued in glossy images, and about the way his hand had the familiarity of someone who paid for things to be taken care of. She also thought about the EpiPen's click, and how the action had felt like a quiet promise kept to the body itself. Act first, explain later. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee gone to the bitter edge. Tyler bounded into the tiny kitchen with the kind of energy only a child can manage before breakfast and asthma maintenance had been considered. He wore the tie he'd chosen himself that day, an old, stained blue one, which had once been Jennifer's father's before it became Tyler's treasure. He thrust it at her, a lopsided loop of fabric that made her laugh. Half of her wanted to cry with the smallness of it. "Mom," he said, voice full of importance, "guess what? Mrs. Lyle says she thinks I'll win first prize at the science fair. She says rockets are basically like math." "You'll win because you practiced," Jennifer said, smoothing a hand through his hair, "and because your rocket has a better nose cone than half of the ones in the city." He shrugged a small, proud shoulder, "and because Mr. Carter said my presentation had feelings." The word landed in her like a splinter. Mr. Carter from Tyler's school had arranged an after-school tutoring session weekly as part of a community program. That was the other life, thin threads of help woven into the city's more generous corners. Jennifer kissed the top of Tyler's head and moved to the cabinet to pull out the inhaler. She checked its date and clicked the spacer into place the way she had been taught. The label said, "Refill." The label said, $134.99. "You gonna be okay?" Tyler asked, watching her with the small, clear worry of a child who knows the outlines of their parents' boundaries. I'm okay, she said, and she believed it in small increments. In the way her muscles remembered how to do every job she'd ever been paid for, in the fact that she had got him to school. Tyler bounded into the tiny kitchen with the kind of energy only a child can manage before breakfast and asthma maintenance had been considered. He wore the tie he'd chosen himself that day, an old stained blue one, which had once been Jennifer's father's before it became Tyler's treasure. He thrust it at her, a lopsided loop of fabric that made her laugh. Half of her wanted to cry with the smallness of it. Mom, he said, voice full of importance, guess what? Mrs. Lyle says she thinks I'll win first prize at the science fair. She says rockets are basically like math. You'll win because you practiced, Jennifer said, smoothing a hand through his hair, and because your rocket has a better nose cone than half of the ones in the city. He shrugged a small, proud shoulder. And because Mr. Carter said my presentation had feelings. The word landed in her like a splinter. Mr. Carter from Tyler's school had arranged an after-school tutoring session weekly as part of a community program. That was the other life, thin threads of help woven into the city's more generous corners. Jennifer kissed the top of Tyler's head and moved to the cabinet to pull out the inhaler. She checked its date and clicked the spacer into place the way she had been taught. The label said refill. The label said $134.99. You gonna be okay? Tyler asked, watching her with the small, clear worry of a child who knows the outlines of their parents' boundaries. I'm okay, she said, and she believed it in small increments. In the way her muscles remembered how to do every job she'd ever been paid for, in the fact that she had got him to school and back despite the rent being 2 days late. But the truth of okay had invisible debts attached, like paper slips. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She thought of leaving it, of letting the unknown be unknown, but something prickled in her like a premonition. She answered. Jennifer? The voice was familiar, the cadence of a man who had answered too many high-end conference lines at 3 in the afternoon. It was Marcus. I'm sorry to call so early. There's a gala next week. It's a charity for the Children's Hospital. I wanted, if it's not presumptuous, if Tyler would like to come. Bring him. There's a section for the kids that has a planetarium, rockets. My associate can reserve seats. She imagined the way Victoria would slice into the rumor. Marcus Whitfield taking the cleaning supervisor's son to his gala. She imagined her mother's voice telling her to watch what she accepted. She imagined Tyler's face when he saw an actual planetarium ceiling. She imagined an entire litany of reasons to say no, and one very small string of reasons to say yes. Thank you, she said instead, because it felt less like a decision and more like a possibility. I'll think about it. You don't have to decide now, Marcus said. There was a gentle awkwardness in his voice, an unfamiliar humility. I'm not offering charity. I wanted to share something. If you don't want to. No, she interrupted before she could let her guard slip. The word was practiced, tidy. I'll let you know. They spoke for 30 seconds more, about trivialities that were not trivial. The size of Tyler's shoe, whether he had a favorite color. He offered to have his executive assistant handle the details. He asked for a school day when Tyler would be free. He did not volunteer money, did not make promises. When she hung up, the card in her pocket warmed against her leg like a small ember. She went to work. The daylight in the city seemed to have a new glare, as if transparency had been turned up. Her crew joked, small, private things about the spectacle in the hospital office that had been in the grapevine by noon. Whitfield, one of them said, flicking his rag with a smirk, you left your EpiPen in his suit, Jen. Big time. Jennifer shrugged humorlessly. Pride is a private currency. It is spent easily and repaid rarely. She scrubbed a corridor floor that gleamed like a stage, and counted the time in a ledger of repetition. Sweep, mop, polish, move on. The world outside had not adjusted to the drama. The world was indifferent and miraculous in equal measure. That night, Mrs. Lyle called to tell her Tyler's teacher wanted to schedule a meeting about his asthma triggers. There were forms to sign, medications to request. The inhaler's sticker price sat in the middle of the table like a judgment. Jennifer walked to the window and stared at the distant skyline that belonged to other people's decisions. Marcus Whitfield's gift card sat in her jacket like a dare. She slept fitfully. Dreams stitched together images of mahogany desks and small hands and lilies crawling like conspirators across white sheets. In the dream, she could feel the press of Marcus's suit against the hospital floor, could see a future like a card left half-folded under a couch cushion. She woke with the taste of something metallic in her mouth and knew that for the first time in a long time, she had a real lever in front of her. A single invitation, an uncertain kindness, and the possibility of a life slightly rearranged. The next morning, the phone rang before the sun had finished gathering itself. She answered on the second ring. "Jennifer," Patricia's voice said, familiar, quick, the voice of someone who manages other people's emergencies as a profession. "This is Patricia. Marcus asked me to call. He wanted to say thanks again, and would you accept tickets for the gala? He's insisted. I can send the details. He thinks Tyler would like the planetarium. He also wanted to say that the company is looking to hire, temporarily, additional supervisors for their maintenance teams. It's not a charity thing, it's a paid position with benefits." Jennifer's hand tightened around the phone. The word benefits landed like a bell. Health benefits meant inhalers with no heroin of choice. Benefits meant no more $47 rituals. Benefits meant sleep that arrived without a ledger. "How much?" she asked, because a job could still be a trap depending on where its strings were knotted. "It's a livable wage," Patricia said. "Marcus wants someone he can trust. He said you saved him. He mentioned your name to the board, and, well, there might be an opening. He asked if you'd consider it." She said she'd think about it. She did not say yes. She did not say no. On her way home, she stopped at the pharmacy. The inhaler was waiting under a fluorescent light like a small, clinical gravestone. "We can put this on an emergency plan," the pharmacist said. "There's paperwork." She paid with a debit card that complained about the insufficient funds. The register printed a receipt with a message. Available balance, $47.12. The minute she walked out with the inhaler in a bag, it felt suddenly more real. She had the medication. She had the momentary relief. She also had a card in her pocket, and a man who had looked at her in the hospital corridor with an expression that had not been purely transactional. That weekend, as Tyler obsessively checked the parts of his model rocket and tied tiny thrusters with almost criminal precision, Jennifer sat at the little kitchen table with the card and a stack of bills and let the mathematics unfurl. If she took the job, would the change feel like a hand up or a chain? Would she still be Jennifer Mitchell, the woman who scrubbed other people's rooms until her knees complained, or would she become the woman Marcus Whitfield hired, a shorthand that might stick to her like glue? Pride warred with practicality. She had held Tyler above her own needs so often that it had become a reflexive posture. To accept was to open a door to gratitude and to expectation. To refuse was to protect a lineage of self-reliance she had inherited from her mother, who taught her the dignity of a hard day's work and the unromantic holiness of steady paychecks. She became, in the kitchen light, the arithmetic of both. On Sunday, she met Mrs. Lyle for coffee and let the conversation drift, as small-town and neighborly as their building allowed. "He's a nice man," Mrs. Lyle said of Marcus Whitfield, the way you might mention a weather event. "Saved him, did you? Well, aren't you something?" The day was full of little judgments and bigger silences. Jennifer watched Tyler play with his rocket, watched the way he attached the nose cone with the precise concentration of someone building a future out of cardboard and glue. She thought of the planetarium dome, and the way stars have always seemed like a promise that you can point to and say, "See, there it is." She had not told Tyler about the gala. She had not yet told anyone the particularities of the kiss in the corridor because it was a thing that lived in the body like a private bruise. The kiss had been pragmatic and humiliating. And in the hours after it, she had felt something shift, not merely in how other people looked at her, but in how she looked at herself. The reflex to bend towards someone's need had been rewarded and complicated. When need meets power, there is a long negotiation in the center. Her phone buzzed again that evening. A message from an unknown number. Tyler Whitfield? No, that was absurd. She opened it. Jennifer, this is Marcus. I'm going to be frank and clumsy and perhaps too forward. Would you meet me for coffee? I want to hear about you beyond the corridor. No charity, no strings, just conversation. I own a lot of things, but none of them include the right to define you. Please, I'd like to know the woman who put my life back in my hands. She read it 3 times. The message had the soft, fumbling tone of a man used to commanding rooms and not knowing how to ask for the language of ordinary human exchange. It was the kind of directness that could be a relief or a trap. If she went, she would be entering another world, a coffee with an outsider who owed her nothing and wanted something that had the odor of intimacy. If she refused, she would be protecting her tiny, stubborn domain. If she accepted, Tyler's inhaler would be safe, and their rent would maybe not, stop being a balancing act on a wire. There were unknowns folded into the card in her pocket like razor blades wrapped in silk. That night, she placed the inhaler on the counter, as if anchoring it to the counter would anchor their lives. She laid out Tyler's rocket parts on the table like a map of choices. In the couch's small lamp glow, she memorized the feel of the card in her jacket and the way the city's lights brazenly made promises they did not intend to keep. She wanted, in a way she had not allowed herself to want in years, to be seen in a place that was not defined by the floors she cleaned and the meals she skipped. She wanted Tyler to feel, for a night, that the world was larger than the towering interest of his inhaler's price tag. She also wanted to be more than grateful to a man who, for all the charm of his apology, was still the owner of buildings where other people scrubbed the floors. In the dark, she rehearsed answers. She set rules in her head. If she met him, she would go as Jennifer Mitchell, not as a problem to be solved. She would listen. She would tell him, flatly, that she could not be turned into a charity case. She would ask questions. She would watch for the way he treated people who served him coffee or opened doors. She would refuse to sign a silence that sounded like sale. At 2 in the morning, as the city breathed and the street noise receded, she slept, and in her dreams she stood in the hospital corridor again. The lilies bowed with the weight of their own pollen. Marcus was on the floor, and she had her hands on his pulse. She pressed her lips to his mouth and imagined waking someone not into dependence, but into mutuality. The dream blurred into a phone alarm that said it was time for a new day. The morning came with the ordinary crunch of cereal and the tiny, triumphant smile on Tyler's face when he managed to launch a test rocket that arced across the little backyard and landed in a neighbor's recycling bin. He clapped with the kind of joy luck never affords twice. Jennifer clapped too, because that is what mothers do when a child's heart expands. They applaud the small, fierce victories. She walked to the bus stop, inhaler in the small pouch at her belt, the card in her jacket like a secret. Her coworkers were gossiping about the gala invite as if it were a scandalous invitation for her to step into a world that smelled of expensive perfume and knives hidden in smiles. "You gonna wear a dress?" one of them teased. No, she said, and it was true. She would not pretend to be something she wasn't. She had 2 dresses that still fit. One had a small tear at the seam, and one had faded from too many washings. She thought of showing up in a dress that could be honest, clean, simple, not apologetic. At the stop, a woman with a stroller offered Jennifer a seat and thanked her for holding the door. The city was a collage of small courtesies and sharp edges. Jennifer rode the bus into the glass towers. The city reflected in the windows like an accusation of all the lives that could have been different. She thought of Marcus's green eyes and the way gratitude had looked like something she might be expected to keep payment for. At the office, Marcus was already at work, the building's atrium a cathedral of glass and curated plants. When her cart clicked over the stone lobby, someone looked up and frowned. Security briefly stopped her, a polite handshake of protocol, but then Marcus appeared in the lobby as if he'd been waiting, and his face dissolved into something open. He stepped toward her, not with the practiced distance of someone who commands, but with a gait that said he didn't want to make her uncomfortable. "Jennifer," he said again, and this time his voice was stripped of ceremony. "If you have 5 minutes, coffee, downtown. No press, no board members, no charity. Just coffee." She looked at the badge around his neck, at the way his watch flashed. He had told Patricia to offer tickets and potentially a position. He had made an effort to disentangle help from patronage, and the gesture had the quality of someone who had misread his own power and wanted to do it right this time. She felt the skitter of a dozen tiny warring votes in her chest. 5 minutes, she said. She accepted because she wanted to know what was behind a man with a watch like a planet, behind a suit that had seen more of the world than she had. She accepted because Tyler's inhaler was full, and a job might mean stability. She accepted because she was curious about kindness that asked for nothing in return. They walked to a small cafe where the coffee was decent and the lighting forgiving. She sat with her hands around a paper cup and watched him watch the world in the way rich men watch people, discovering them like a map. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "You could have left things the way they were." "I could have," he agreed, and his voice had the metallic tang of admission. "I used to think power meant fixing things. I'm learning, slowly, that it means listening. I don't want to buy your life, Jennifer. I want to create space for it to exist differently if you want." She wanted to ask what differently meant, but instead she watched the barista pour foam in a slow, patient arc and thought of Tyler's rocket nose cone and how a small adjustment could change the arc of an entire flight. Their conversation that morning folded into ordinary spaces. About Tyler, about how Marcus had been allergic to lilies since childhood and had spent his adult life avoiding wedding bouquets as if they were landmines. Marcus listened when she spoke about Tyler's math obsession, about the way the neighbor had given him a used microscope. He asked questions about her cleaning crew and seemed genuinely curious about the logistics of keeping the towers gleaming. He asked about her mother, about where she had learned to be so sturdy. When he offered, finally, that the company could use a supervisor who understood the work from the ground up, the words fell into the table like a key into a lock. He looked at her for a long time as if asking permission to change the lock. "I'm not asking you to take anything you don't want," he said. "I'm asking if you'd consider it." Jennifer could feel the old armor lift in places and thicken in others. She thought of the bus ride home when the boy with the balloon had chased pigeons and had looked happy without reason. She thought of the way Marcus's gratitude had not been performed, but had been messy and human, like someone trying to learn a language they'd been privileged to never need. She said she would think about it. She did not say yes. She did not say no. As they left the cafe and returned to the glass pits and the hum of cleaning carts and the smell of burnt coffee, Jennifer could not know what the future would demand of her in return for accepting a different life. She could not know whether accepting would be an ascent or a shift that eroded her. All she knew at that moment was the small, steady fact of Tyler's laugh in the other room and the cheap inhaler that no longer felt like a luxury. The card in her jacket was a hinge. The hospital corridor had been a pivot. The city kept pulling people into its current, some to sink, some to sail. She was, for now, in the middle, arms spread out to balance. She had accepted coffee. She had accepted a conversation. She had not yet accepted an altered life. When she returned home that evening, she found a note slipped under her door. It was from Marcus's assistant. 2 gala tickets and a line that said, Please do not feel obligated. It also said, "Will be at the planetarium at 7." The card in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, like the weight of a decision that would tip lives. Tyler was waiting at the kitchen table with a half-assembled rocket and a grin that made the room too small. He looked up when she walked in, and the grin widened like a sunrise. "Did you win?" he asked. "No," she said, sitting across from him, "but we might have a chance to see stars up close." She watched the expression on his face change as the possibility settled in. There are moments as a parent when the world rearranges itself to make space for a child's wonder, and one small yes can be the hinge of 1,000 small goods. She kissed the top of his head, tasting coffee and the faint salt of worry. In the other pocket, the card pressed warm and true. Outside, the city lights went on like a string of small promises. Inside, in their tiny kitchen, Jennifer measured the breaths of a child who trusted her for everything and felt the first real tremor of a life on the edge of being different. There were still rules she would set if she accepted the path Marcus offered. She would make certain demands: clarity about boundaries, a guarantee of a formal job offer with pay and benefits, respect for her autonomy and for Tyler. She would not be a story to be told at a dinner party. She would not be silence in exchange for safety. Those were lines she would draw before she stepped across anything. When she sat on the edge of the couch that night, watching Tyler finish his rocket kit, she felt like someone waiting at a crossroads with an unmarked map. The hospital corridor had been the moment that made the world notice her. The card in her pocket was the invitation to let the world notice, with all the risks that came with it. She thought of the kiss, how quick, how practical it had been, and of the way that single motion had been refracted into rumor and opportunity and danger. She did not yet know whether she would accept the job or the gala or Marcus's offers of help. She did not yet know if the next step would be freedom or a route that eroded her. What she knew was that she had choices to make, and that the choices would be made with Tyler's small life curled against the center. At 2 in the morning, she woke to a sound like fabric rasping, a sound that had once been a whisper only she could hear. Tyler sat up in bed, face pinched, breath short, as if someone had folded the lungs small. In the pale kitchen lamp's light, she was a woman who had learned procedures by necessity. Spacer, inhale, breathe, calm. The inhaler tasted like victory and like debt. She strapped the spacer and watched Tyler's chest expand, then relax. Her hands were steady because there had been practice. Her decision score was sharpened by months of small deprivation. She monitored him until the wheeze faded and the room made sense again. As she sat at the kitchen table afterward with a cup of coffee that she did not taste, the phone buzzed. She read the text without surprise. Marcus. He had sent a message. "I'm glad he's okay. I wanted to say something more about how he looked at you when he woke up. You saved him in a way only you could. If you ever want to talk, I am not offering charity, I'm offering company." Jennifer looked at the message and thought of the way power can be rearranged when an employer seeks to be a partner. She thought of her mother's voice and Tyler's laugh and the $47 that kept saying no. She thought of Victoria's eyes and the way gossip could become a weapon if you let it. She set the phone down. She had to make more than a decision about a job. She had to make a decision about the architecture of her life with Tyler at its center. Outside, the city slept and dreamed in glass. Inside, 2 breaths later, Tyler's chest rose and fell and the world righted itself. She would make the choice later, she told herself. Tonight, she would let the thought be a possibility and not a decree. Tonight, she would sleep with the card in her pocket and the inhaler by the bed and the knowledge that she had, in one unplanned, ridiculous motion, altered the course of a man's day, and perhaps, if she allowed it, the course of her own. She told herself she would make the choice later. For now, she would measure the breath of the city and the breath of her son and let the rest be possibilities. But choices, once placed on the kitchen table, have a way of insisting. The gala was a week away, and the planetarium invitation had the quiet pressure of a small tide. Accept, and a new shore might become reachable. Refuse, and the tide would still lap at her feet. The night of the gala, the building smelled of wine and lemon oil, the odd commonality that knit floors Jennifer cleaned to tables where donors wrote checks. She had bought a dress that was honest, linen hemmed carefully by a woman 2 doors down, who charged by the seam but sewed with a conscience. Tyler wore a collared shirt that his aunt had pressed with a steam iron like a ritual. He bounded into the car Marcus had insisted on bringing, thrilled the way a child is when an adult's car feels like a spaceship. Jennifer sat in the back and watched him inhale the new place with wide eyes. The planetarium was a black bowl speckled with light. The ceiling unfolded into stars and projections that made Tyler gasp and reach for the dark. Marcus settled beside them with a quiet that belonged to someone who had learned how to be still when wonders happened. He did not drape himself across the night. He folded around their small cluster like a courtesy. Tyler leaned on his arm, as if he had known Marcus for days. "That was my favorite part," Marcus said when the show dimmed, his voice low and happy in a way that embarrassed him and made him honest. He took Tyler's ear seriously when the boy began to explain trajectory and nose cones with the solemnness of a priest. He asked questions not like someone marking questions off a list, but like someone listening, because the answers might change him. Jennifer watched how he listened and felt the slow accrual of trust. Victoria was present in the perimeter the way winter hangs on a doorstep. She was a varnish of elegance with a scent no one could mistake for ordinary. Her smile arrived like a razor. She moved through the room like cold air, and the conversation around her thinned, as if people made a conscious sort of distance. She made 1 or 2 sharp remarks about the surprising company of the Whitfield family's chosen guests. She positioned herself where cameras might catch a certain tableau, the kind that could feed social pages for weeks. At the reception, someone whispered about Jennifer in a tone designed to be small, but heard. "Isn't she the one who kissed him? Oh, the cleaning supervisor." Each euphemism was a tiny demand that she shrink. But Tyler's hand found hers and squeezed. He had a sticky thumb from the concession counter's cotton candy, and his amusement was pure and dangerous in its ability to shift attention. Marcus navigated the room with a kind of attention that didn't parade, but that did make gentle alterations. He introduced Jennifer as the woman who had handled a situation, and then, when someone attempted to make the kiss into a punchline, he cut it off with a look that made the speaker step back. He called her Jennifer like a possession he intended not to file away, but to know. That naming steadied her more than she expected. Later, near the planetarium exit, where the ceiling gave way to the city's glow, a woman from the board, one of the people Victoria had cultivated, asked in a tone that pretended to be curiosity, "So, Miss Mitchell, will you be accepting any position with us?" The question was a probe. The implication was that acceptance would reshape the ladders in the building in ways that would be either admirable or scandalous, depending on who reported it. Jennifer's answer was diplomatic and true. "I'm considering it," she said. "Only if it's a real job. Pay, benefits, clearly wrote expectations. I won't be someone's token." The woman blinked, processing a reply that refused to be small. Marcus's face was turned toward Jennifer in that moment like a student toward a teacher he wanted to please. He did not interrupt. He let her make the terms out loud, and in that silence, his consent to her conditions became part of the scene. Victoria watched the exchange with a kind of narrowing interest. She made notes, not of people's faces, but of the way the room could be remodeled to accommodate or exclude. That night, Jennifer walked home with Tyler's chatter in her ears and a new ledger forming in her head. What she would need to insist on, what she could settle for, the boundaries she would not cross. In the days that followed, Marcus's pursuit was measured and material in ways that had nothing to do with money. There were small gifts, an old tin rocket that had been part of his childhood attic, repaired and sent with a ribbon. Tickets to a museum exhibit on aeronautics that arrived with a handwritten note. Thought of Tyler. There were also practicalities. Patricia sent an email outlining a job description for a site supervisor position that included holidays, health care, and a pathway to more administrative responsibilities. Marcus's offer had been translated into form and number, an important step that turned rumor into a box that could be opened and examined. Still, nothing in Jennifer's life unspooled like a film in which everything simply caught and settled. The rumor mill hummed. Someone snapped a photo of her at a donor table and posted it with an insinuating caption. Victoria's presence at the next board meeting was not merely attendance, it was execution. She circulated a memorandum questioning the optics of hiring someone from the service staff directly into a management role and suggested a formal review. It was a move that could be framed as fiduciary concern. In practice, it was a pressure tactic. Marcus read the memo and put it aside. In the boardroom the next week, Victoria argued with the clinical precision of someone trained to wield influence. "We need to preserve the trust of our donors," she said. "Perception matters." Her tone was velvet. Some of the board members, who had been recruited by decades of shared dinners and philanthropic courtesy, nodded like weather vanes. Marcus's response was not a counterattack of money, but a recalibration of responsibility. He did not bully, he rearranged. He introduced a proposal that created a training and promotion program for maintenance staff, one that had been quietly piloted in another building on his suggestion months before. The program proposed formal assessments, pay scales, and clear pathways into supervisory roles, policies that, if handled correctly, would legitimize internal promotions and erase the fiction that a single hire could be improvised. He framed it as a structural fix that would help everyone, not just one person. Inclusion needs infrastructure, not optics, he said, and the statement landed like a formal seal. Victoria's instrument sharpened. She could argue about budgets, about donors, about the terms of policy, but it was harder to insist that one woman's possibility be turned into scandal when a program that might raise the floor for all employees had been proposed. Her efforts narrowed into personal attacks. She started quietly pushing stories into social pages, speculation about a romantic entanglement, about impropriety. The gossip was sticky and relentless. Jennifer kept her own counsel. She read the board motions when they were public and responded with her own set of boundaries. She called Patricia and requested that any job offer be plainly written and signed, with clear reporting lines and assurances of non-interference. She insisted on a probationary period that allowed her to evaluate the company as much as the company evaluated her. Marcus agreed to all of it without ceremony. He signed the documents and asked only for one thing in return: that she tell him honestly if anything felt like tokenism rather than genuine inclusion. It was not money that made the difference, though the pay was significant, practical, and life-changing. It was Marcus's willingness to labor at the edges of his own instincts and to put the policies on paper. Tyler's science fair came next. He insisted on explaining his launch trajectory to anyone who would listen. He explained the weight distribution with the solemnity of a man who expected his rocket to be admired forever. Marcus showed up unannounced and sat in the folding chair in the gym like a father who had an honest, private tenderness for small triumphs. He watched Tyler and then watched Jennifer watching Tyler. It was not the publicity of showing up that mattered. It was the simple arithmetic of presence, of a seat taken and a hand given. After Tyler's presentation, when the judges had given him a ribbon and the smell of plastic and glue softened into conversation, a teacher remarked on how steady he had been. Marcus leaned close enough for only Jennifer to hear. "He has a way of making physics sound like a poem," he said, and for a moment the world simplified into a line of syllables that spoke about hope. Not everything improved linearly. Victoria had not given up. She began a quieter campaign of undermining the training program's budget, whispering to donors about fiscal prudence and the dangers of favoritism. She sought to find precedent, to create enough bureaucratic friction that even sensible changes would stall. When the friction rose to a formal vote, Marcus did something that had consequences far removed from headline-grabbing power displays. He took a step most of his peers had never seen. He put his name on the training program's leadership. He said he would commit funds not anonymously, but as part of an annual company initiative, and placed a personal caveat that the program's success would be measured publicly. He framed it as accountability, not power. The board, to its credit, did not love the idea of being measured by outcomes, but it preferred data over rumor. Victoria lost some momentum. The things she could do in private, plant stories, pull strings, were harder to sustain when there was a public ledger showing salaries, promotions, and the names of those who benefited. It did not erase the resentment. At the holiday party, Victoria made a toast that included the phrase, "raised by lucky coincidences," and eyes glanced toward Jennifer with enough pity to bruise. Jennifer kept her posture and answered with a smile that was wary and polite. There was a small victory in being present and not collapsing under the weight of other people's small cruelties. Then the second reaction happened, more subtle, more dangerous, not for its violence, but for its timing. It was a dinner with a small group, a donor, a board chair, Victoria, and Marcus. The centerpiece was a tall arrangement of lilies, and someone had not realized that the bouquet, meant to be ornamental, carried pollen. There were plates passed and cocktails lifted. Marcus, who had spent his life avoiding certain bouquets, laughed at a joke and reached for a piece of bread. Within 20 minutes, his voice honed into a different pitch. He coughed, a small hacking sound at first. He murmured that he felt strange, and the world thinned as color leached from his face. The table tipped into focused alarm. The boardroom staff was quick. Someone called for water and a nurse. Marcus, who had been lucid the first time they met him on the floor, blinked and misjudged the severity of his own condition. He waved them off with the kind of embarrassed stubbornness of someone who did not like to be the center of emergency. He tried to steady himself, and the sound he made was a noise between fear and pride. Jennifer was there because she had come to the building after a late shift to sign a form. She had not planned to be at a dinner, but had been asked to come into the lobby for a quick question about the new custodial schedule. She arrived just as Marcus's face shifted into the pale hollowness she had seen before. The air filled with the scent that had once been only on a mahogany desk and now seemed to have found a domain in the room's chairs, a faint, maddening undertow of lilies. The staff moved with protocol. An EpiKit appeared, oxygen was readied, someone called for an ambulance. Marcus shook his head, stubborn as an old man about to be fussed over. "I'm fine," he tried to say. Then the world narrowed. His throat closed, and then he became flustered. There was fear behind his eyes now, not the polished control of a CEO, but the rawness of someone who was suddenly small. Jennifer did not think, not in the expansive moral terms she sometimes used at home. Her reactions were practical and old. Check airway, monitor breathing, keep him calm. She leaned in and took command in a way that surprised people who had only seen her with a mop. She told someone to call the ambulance and then told another to clear the room. She tapped the auto-injector from the kit into the meat of his thigh. It was the same movement she had made before, only this time the setting was a porcelain place where board chairs sat like jurors. Marcus resisted the idea of an ambulance, embarrassed by the attention, and then panic rose like a tide. Jennifer's voice was an anchor. "Marcus, you need care. You've had a reaction. We need to get you to the hospital now." Her words were not an invasion of privacy. They were a local command in a crisis. He tried to speak and failed. There was a moment when protocol and human concern braided. A medic arrived and began to assess him. The oxygen mask hissed. The phone flashes said that an ambulance was en route. Victoria had the kind of look that could be read as concern or calculation. For a sliver of time, she demanded to know whether the hospital would be a spectacle. Then she was shushed into the corner by an orderly who knew to move the room into privacy. The ambulance arrived, and the paramedics worked with the clinical rhythm of people who had seen the pattern before: epi, airway, transport. Jennifer rode with them because the paramedic asked if someone who knew his history could come, and because Marcus squeezed her wrist and said faintly, "Stay." At the hospital, he was treated. Doctors explained, with the gravity of people who did this work every day, that he had experienced a biphasic reaction. The first reaction had been treated, but allergic responses can reoccur hours later. They could not say the kiss had anything to do with his survival. They credited epinephrine, oxygen, and the paramedics' timing. That was the medical truth and the protective boundary Jennifer needed to maintain. Facts that rewarded competence, not romanticization. Once stable, when the monitors had flattened into quiet beeps and the staff had faded into efficient soft talk, Marcus looked at Jennifer with an expression that carried a history she had not yet learned to fully read. "You came," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of an emotional ledger she had not asked to open. She felt the pull of embarrassment at his gratitude and an internal memory of the first kiss in the corridor. There had been a strip of absurdity to that action and a moral residue she could not scrub away. He reached for her hand, the same hand he had held when he woke the first time, and this time the touch was less about necessity and more about reaching. "I did what I could," she said, which was true and also a boundary. She had been competent. She had been decisive. She had been necessary. There was no hero story to be spun without the facts. The following hours were a blur of monitors and doctors and the soft exhale of relatives in waiting rooms. Marcus spoke to Jennifer in halting, earnest sentences that left no place for the world's gossip to sit comfortably. "I don't know how to say what I mean without sounding like I'm buying a thing I can't," he said. "But I want you to know—" He stopped, like someone who had stumbled on the edge of a cliff. "You don't have to say it now," Jennifer said. It would be easy to collect words like jewelry and wear them for a night and then return to the old routines. She had seen men do that. She had seen offers become expectations that fit like a cuff too tight and then slit open lives with a single slip. He stared at the ceiling and then down at his hands. The room smelled of antiseptic and coffee, and the barely perceptible perfume of someone worrying. "When I opened my eyes that day on the floor," he began, and the breath he took after that seemed to reset him, "I realized something. I realized I was used to people stepping up because they were paid to. I was used to people performing the kind of care that fit their role. You didn't. You touched me like someone who had no investment in being seen by me. It changed something in me, because I don't know when I last had someone do something that wasn't transactional." Jennifer chewed the inside of her cheek. Her life had been a graveyard of things done without the luxury of being witnessed. The sting of being atomized into gossip still burned, but underneath, something else was being offered: genuine recognition. She had a list of what she would accept, in writing, and a lifetime of reasons to distrust easy kindness. "Recognition isn't redemption," she said, "and I'm not looking to be someone's moral ledger." Marcus laughed softly, a sound like relief. "I know. That's why I'm trying to be purposeful now rather than performative." He looked at her like a man trying to unlearn reflexes. This is going to sound sudden and ridiculous, but I love you, Jennifer. Not in the story kind of way, but in the way that makes me less interested in what other people think and more interested in you." Those 3 small words landed and levitated in the room like fragile glass. Jennifer felt the tremor of them, of their weight, of his vulnerability. She also felt the sensible ledger in her head, cataloging motives and consequences. He had said it with a transparency that felt true, but words, she had learned, needed to be proven by deeds. She did not discount what he said, but she would not let emotion undo the careful boundaries she had constructed for Tyler's sake. "You're not the first man who's told me he wants to fix things for me," she said, blunt, in the way that sometimes serves as armor. "I need to know what love looks like in practice, Marcus, not gestures at dinners, not charity, practical arrangements. I want job specifics on paper, a guarantee that Tyler's needs are accounted for, and space where I can decline something without repercussion. I want to know how this will work if we disagree." He took it in like a man learning a new language. "Then we will write it," he said. "We'll put it on paper. I will not have you reduced, and I will not have you feel bought. I will make you evidence, not a rumor." He smiled then, the kind that softened the hard edges of a man who was practiced at making decisions, but not at being open. She slept that night with the light on and the sound of city cars below. In the small hours, she considered the shape of the word love as it had been used against and for people she had seen fail and succeed. She finally told herself that love that promised safety and honored agency might be worth the risk of stepping into something that could, at worst, ruin her pride, and at best, rearrange their lives for good. She did not in that moment decide forever. She decided to let the conversation proceed, to let the paperwork be precise, to let the small, trusted steps be the measure. They negotiated terms like two people intent on making a contract that did not feel like a sale. Marcus insisted on clarity, and Jennifer insisted on autonomy. She requested quarterly check-ins with a neutral HR officer. She asked for a written guarantee of pay scale and health benefits, and a formal complaint channel protected from the whim of social gossip. She asked for flexibility for Tyler's medical needs and to be able to refuse media appearances. Marcus agreed and asked only for honesty and patience as he learned to be less automatic with power. It was work, tedious, sometimes humiliating work, and it was mutual. He arranged a meeting with the board where he explained the training program and pledged to fund it personally, naming the program in honor of a mentor who had once shown him a form of grace. He also, privately, used his influence to quietly settle an old back rent that Jennifer's landlord had been threatening to evict her over. He paid it directly to the landlord with no fanfare and insisted it not be announced. Jennifer discovered the payment because a polite, anonymous envelope arrived at her door with a note. "Use this for the kids' things. No need to thank me." It was, in its anonymity, one of the purest forms of help she had ever received. She was grateful and complicated at once. Victoria's campaign dwindled into isolated comments and a scathing op-ed that attempted to frame the training program as a vanity project. Marcus did not counter with public smears. Instead, he made the data public: salaries, promotion rates, training outcomes. Numbers have a way of becoming inconvenient for gossip. He also insisted that the next hiring cycle include a third-party oversight committee. Victoria's power, which had been a slow, insidious pressure along social lines, lost traction in governance, where evidence mattered more than insinuation. She continued to exist in his orbit, but her threat reduced from an active saboteur to a fellow in a boardroom who occasionally objected to policy. In time, she found a new place, an exit, to be retold some weeks later as a reflection of interest diverging rather than a moral failure. People adjust. Life for Jennifer did not become a smooth film. Bills still arrived. Nights still ended with her counting receipts. But there was a new margin, a margin that meant Tyler could attend a summer camp for kids who loved rockets, and the inhaler was no longer a single line item that could mean disaster if skipped. She took a management training class offered by the company and began to understand procurement schedules and supply chains in ways that made her feel a different kind of power, the power of competence. Her crew members received raises as the training program unfurled under the oversight Marcus had promised. They began to see a ladder in a building they had previously believed had only floors. Marcus, in turn, learned how to be small in private. He learned how to do a simple task for Tyler, a thankless thing that mattered more than any gala, like reheating tomato soup to the exact degree the boy liked. He learned that showing up to a parent-teacher conference without a camera in the room carried more weight than any public act. He began to take classes on organizational responsibility because he wanted to understand the people whose labor structurally supported his life. There were moments of comedic discomfort. He tried to assemble Tyler's rocket engine with an earnestness that bordered on the comical and succeeded in spilling small parts across the living room carpet. He brought home a bag of tools and left a pastry tin on the kitchen counter, and for a time, he stood awkwardly at the dishwasher watching how Jennifer folded towels with a speed that made him feel like his hands were in the wrong profession. But tenderness often arrives cloaked in the ridiculous acts of learning. The turning point did not come with a single grand event. It occurred in a series of small adjustments. Marcus standing by when a manager dismissed a janitor's request for respect, Jennifer standing up and explaining why that felt wrong, the manager apologizing and then altering a schedule. It happened when Tyler's school called to inform them that he had been asked to present his rocket at a city showcase, and the registration fee had been covered without announcement. And when Marcus, privately and without fanfare, met with the school principal to ensure Tyler's accommodations were understood. It happened in the everyday, where the old scripts were not simply discarded, but rewritten slowly, deliberately. 6 months later, the apartment that had once smelled of coffee gone sharp now held a careful balance of new things and old. There was a shelf with Tyler's rockets, both the homemade and restored tin one Marcus had found, next to school books and a stack of library volumes on physics. Jennifer's cleaning supplies were still tucked away under the sink, the honesty of the job remained, but beside them there was a letter from the company confirming her promotion, supervisor of facilities, with a description that included training responsibilities and a seat on the committee that oversaw promotions. It happened in the everyday, where the old scripts were not simply discarded, but rewritten slowly, deliberately. 6 months later, the apartment that had once smelled of coffee gone sharp now held a careful balance of new things and old. There was a shelf with Tyler's rockets, both the homemade and the restored tin one Marcus had found, next to school books and a stack of library volumes on physics. Jennifer's cleaning supplies were still tucked away under the sink, the honesty of the job remained, but beside them there was a letter from the company confirming her promotion, supervisor of facilities, with a description that included training responsibilities and a seat on the committee that oversaw promotions. It was a title she had fought for, defined by her work and not by others' stories about her. They had moved only a short distance. Jennifer had insisted on staying close to the neighborhood that held Mrs. Lyle and the corner store where Tyler loved the woman who ran the counter. Marcus's insistence on privacy meant their life was not a parade. He did, however, respect rituals. He began to join Tyler on Saturday mornings to work on rockets in the same small backyard they had always used, and sometimes he would bring coffee that was good enough to make Jennifer laugh. He learned how to tighten a screw without glowering and how to ask for help when he could not understand something that seemed trivial to the world that had made him comfortable. Victoria's departure from the board was framed as a professional divergence. Publicly, the narrative softened into an urban story about shifting alliances. Privately, people said Victoria had always preferred control to compromise, and sometimes the world simply decides the cost of a fight is too high. The quieter people, the janitors, the receptionists, the cafeteria staff, watched how the programs affected payroll and life and spoke about it in ways that made gossip feel smaller and real outcomes larger. There were nights when Jennifer doubted. Old anxieties flared in the dark when Tyler's inhaler rattled in the night, or when the rent came due and the numbers insisted on being strict. In those dark hours, she breathed like a parent breathing through a treadmill of problems. Take one step, then another. Marcus did not eliminate the worry, he sat with it. He learned to hold a flashlight to those middle-of-the-night calculations and to sit with her as she worked through them. He was not a miraculous eraser of history. He was, slowly, an accomplice in a life that had previously been managed alone. Then one ordinary Thursday evening, as sunlight lay flat across the kitchen floor, Marcus asked Jennifer to meet him at the small park near their apartment. They sat on a bench where Tyler liked to pretend the pigeons were rockets that needed rescuing. Marcus's hands were empty in his lap. He had spent 6 months learning to put substance on the things he said. He had attended meetings and reallocated budgets and answered difficult questions frankly. He had also read Emily's old letters, the ones that made him understand the architecture of Jennifer's choices. "Would you marry me?" he asked, not with ceremony or spectacle, but with the simple, quiet human quality of a man asking to be chosen on equal terms. Jennifer looked at him and saw a man who had learned to accept the complexity of a woman's life. She did not answer immediately. There were terms to be discussed, as she said once in a boardroom. Marriage, to her, was another contract of sorts, and therefore required the same level of negotiation she had brought to the hiring paperwork. She asked for time. She asked for mutual counseling, a strange phrase for two adults, but a commitment to share expectations and to mediate when inequalities surfaced. She asked, as she had from the beginning, that her autonomy be preserved, and that any decisions regarding Tyler be mutual. He said yes to all of it. He said yes because he had learned that the charm of absolute gestures is nothing without the small, patient labor of everyday respect. They planned, in a way that honored both of them, no flashy cathedral wedding, but a small afternoon with Tyler allowed to choose the music and Mrs. Lyle baking a cake. On the day she said yes, the weather decided to be generous. There were lilies at the reception, and Jennifer looked at them and breathed easily. They were ornamental now, and not a hazard. The flowers were placed safely out of reach of anyone with known sensitivities. It was a small, domestic sign of the work both had done. Respect for risk, accommodations made willingly. The final kiss they shared that afternoon felt nothing like the corridor's frantic contact. It was a deliberate, mutual joining, a closing of a circle that had begun with an instinct and had been refined with rules and labor. Tyler clapped, as children do when an arc is made visible and their world rearranged into something they can name. Life never became a glossy magazine spread. There were still chores and arguments about whether the garbage had been taken out. There were still nights when the small ledger of bills required scrupulous entry. But there was also the new fact of accountability, a clear job title, a training program that moved others up, an inhaler always on a shelf, and a man who learned to ask for directions before he presumed to fix things. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sit and listen to Jennifer talk about her crew and their problems, learning how to rearrange a schedule or advocate for someone's shift without fanfare. He would sometimes bring flowers that were not lilies, because the lesson of the hospital corridor had lodged itself into him like a memory that demanded better choices. Sometimes, when the city was quiet and Tyler's rocket models caught the late light, Jennifer would remember the first kiss in the corridor, the instinctive action that had been both practical and morally thorny. She would also recall the months of negotiation, the insistence on paperwork, the minute victories that kept dignity intact. In those recollections, she found the shape of a life that had been altered not by a single sensational moment, but by the steady accrual of mutual labor. If one were to ask whether the kiss had been the cause of anything, Jennifer would say no. The kiss had been an instinctive act in a crisis, a human touch in a moment of alarm. It had not been a cure. The nurses and paramedics and the EpiPen and oxygen had been the instruments of reprieve. But the kiss had been a catalyst in the social imagination, the spark that started other things moving. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sit and listen to Jennifer talk about her crew and their problems, learning how to rearrange a schedule or advocate for someone's shift without fanfare. He would sometimes bring flowers that were not lilies, because the lesson of the hospital corridor had lodged itself into him like a memory that demanded better choices. Sometimes, when the city was quiet and Tyler's rocket models caught the late light, Jennifer would remember the first kiss in the corridor, the instinctive action that had been both practical and morally thorny. She would also recall the months of negotiation, the insistence on paperwork, the minute victories that kept dignity intact. In those recollections, she found the shape of a life that had been altered not by a single sensational moment, but by the steady accrual of mutual labor. If one were to ask whether the kiss had been the cause of anything, Jennifer would say no. The kiss had been an instinctive act in a crisis, a human touch in a moment of alarm. It had not been a cure. The nurses and paramedics and the EpiPen and oxygen had been the instruments of reprieve. But the kiss had been a catalyst in the social imagination, the spark that started other things moving. What made those things become life, rather than rumor, was the work that followed. Paperwork, policy, presence, and the slow unlearning of privilege. Neighborhood gossip still had its seasons. Sometimes someone would ask Tyler at school who his stepfather was, and he would answer with the unconcerned patriotism of a boy who had found an ally. People would notice the promotions, and people would wonder at small miracles. Jennifer would smile and say nothing. She had been careful to make no miracle of herself, only an honest account of what she had done and what had been done for her. Months later, on a Saturday morning that smelled like pancakes and old comic books, Marcus found Jennifer cleaning their porch. She had a wet rag and a look that suggested the world could be kept clean in small increments. He leaned on the doorframe and watched her, a look on his face that had long since been softened by learning. "You know," he said, "I used to think people made choices because they needed something from me. I didn't always understand the other way around." He grinned, a quiet thing, and then stepped down to help her with a stubborn blotch. There was no drama in the action. They worked together until the wood was clean. When the porch was done and the coffee warm, Tyler raced out with a model rocket in hand and a grin as wide as a promise. He pressed the rocket into Marcus's hand as if the man had been waiting his whole life to be given something with no strings attached. Marcus crouched down and examined it, and Jennifer watched them both with a chest that eased in a way she had not expected. On the street, life continued its small, ordinary miracles. Mrs. Lyle waved from her window. The corner store owner noted. They had built something neither devotion nor money alone could have purchased. A life in which dignity and help lived side by side, where a woman's agency was protected by both policy and the man who loved her enough to listen and change. If anyone wanted the neat moral, it would be that no single sensational act resolves the complexities of class and care. The hospital's fluorescent lights still hummed in some corridor. The city still had towers where other hands polished floors. But there had been a change. A woman who had once counted $47 as a litany now counted on a different ledger, one with rules she had helped to write, and with a child's laughter that no longer doubled as fear. Would you have acted the same as Jennifer? Would you have accepted the offer or walked away to keep your autonomy? If this story moved you, subscribe for more narratives where ordinary courage meets complicated choices, and tell us in the comments what you would do.